this is, I've been writing about this in a piece I'm writing for a Chinese newspaper at the moment in relation to Japan. Now, the question is, one of the questions they asked me is, if the Americans hadn't turned up in Yokohama or wherever with their iron ships in the 1850s, would Japan have become a modern scientific industrial society? Now, there is a school of thought which I suppose in a way foreshadows the California school, which is saying, well, yes, of course they would, because there is an inevitability about modernity. We are destined to be modern, as it were. The spirit of Hegelian history is towards modernity. And if it hadn't happened in England, then it would have happened in France. And if it hadn't, and so if it hadn't happened there, it would have happened in Japan in the later 19th century. And their evidence for this is really that Japan had all, even more than the Sung, it had all the platform, the runway, using Walt Rostow's metaphor of takeoff. The runway was there. You have high-level technologies. You have a highly industrious people. You have a modern-ish class system. You have a modern-ish political system, a feudal system. You have a Western family system like the English. You have great commercial firms like, well, whatever it is, later ones like, anyway, you can fill in the dots. They've all escaped me. Zaibatsu, as they're now called, these great conglomerate, Mitsubishi is the one I was looking for, Mitsubishi and others. You have a futures market. You have huge penetration. You have vast cities, the biggest in the world, which are really thriving. You have a controlled mortality and fertility, a modern demographic regime. You have extremely good agriculture, high-level rice production. A visitor to Japan in 1850 would have felt they were in England in Daniel Defoe's time, in the end of the 17th, early 18th century. Defoe describes this landscape where he goes through Halifax and Essex, and everything is there except the steam engine. And so it's all in place. And people like the economic historian Hanley and others have said, well, you didn't need the West. Well, they don't actually say that, but it's all implied that it would have taken off. And indeed, even very distinguished modern writers on Japan, the sociologist Ronald Dorr has, I think, written saying, the East would have become a modern industrial society. And he was an expert on factory organizations and education in Japan. Now, I think this is nonsense. And I think there are two ways to show it. One is the history of Europe. It's not something that is generally really widely known. I mean, most people who write about the Industrial Revolution and the modernization in the West think that it was a sort of pan-European thing. England happened to just be the leading horse in this race, but all the other horses were running along. If they'd fallen at the last hurdle, then the French or the Spanish or the Italians or the Dutch or someone would have raced. We'd have had a modern industrial world. There is no evidence of that. In fact, if you look at the history of the great civilizations of Europe, as Braudel did, if you look at Spain, if you look at Italy, if you look at southern France, southern Germany, you find that they were suffering from what Mark Elwin calls the high-level equilibrium trap. That is that they had immense flourishing economies and societies in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But by the end of the 17th century, it had flattened off, that actually they were relatively declining, not just in relation to the north of Europe, but to their past. that the peasants were working harder. It's most obvious in Eastern Europe with the refeudalization of Eastern Europe, but it's evident in the Mediterranean lands of Southern Europe that the land was becoming exhausted, that the peasants were becoming poorer, that the livestock was disappearing, that people were having to work harder. It was what I heard about recently called the Red Queen problem from Alice in Wonderland. You had to run faster and faster to keep in the same place. So most of Europe had reached a high level equilibrium. And if you read The Wealth of Nations carefully, you see this is what actually Adam Smith is describing. He says that we have reached, with half a billion people on Earth, 500 million people on Earth, we have reached the limit of an agrarian civilization. We can divide labor, we can do this a bit more efficiently, but we can't go on like this. And this was a world which, in a remark in Gibbon's autobiography, he says, if you look at the world now, 3/4 of it lives in poverty, misery, dictatorial government systems. Most of people live an unfree and miserable life, illness and so on, uncertainty. And that's where we are in the 1780s across the world. If you'd looked at Europe, that's what most of Europe. The one case that always puzzles people is Holland and the Dutch. And my friend Tony Wrigley, who was an expert on the Dutch, has written quite a lot about, would the Dutch, why wasn't it the Dutch who had the first industrial revolution? They had the first best banks, they had the best navy, they had the best trading systems, they had a great artistic tradition, they had great cities, they had, it appears, everything. Was it just that the British squashed them, or were they? But he concludes there was no way the Dutch, and I mean, I think it's no simple answer, but his answer is they didn't have coal. They had peat, and peat is much less efficient. And you certainly can't use it in a steam engine. But that isn't a satisfactory answer, because the Germans, the North Germans, for example, had some of the characteristics, the Hanseatic League and so on. They had some of the Germanic, the Dutch syndrome, as it were, and they had coal, masses of it, but they still didn't. So it required much more, and this is Ernest Gellner's problem in his book. It required a whole set of political, social, ideological parts of the key, or the combination lock, to unlock modernity. So in a table I made of Japan and England, if you look at England, yes, it has, balanced political system, it has an open social structure, it has a certain family system, it has an advanced agriculture and so on. Yes. You look at Japan, yes. And then no science, and no appropriate technology, because the path along which Japan had been moving in its high-level equilibrium, the path that China had been moving in its high-level equilibrium, was one which wasn't going to end up. It was what my friend Akira Hayami, described as an industrious revolution. I talked about this before. Whereas, which meant applying more and more ingenuity and hard work to solving economic problems, or in Adam Smith's case, the division of labor and so on, thinking about the problem and then making a better rice field, or growing, or treble cropping, or whatever. The English solution, which didn't occur in France, didn't occur in Italy, didn't occur in Spain or anywhere else, was to make labor, allow labor to be very expensive. People are well paid, well fed, well housed, well shod. How can they do that? By using non-human energy. Use your mind, or by chance, because you live in a rainy and windy and pastoral island, put that to use. Use wind power. Invent the first, in Yorkshire, the first windmill. Water power. First, every village in the Doomsday Book, more or less, has a water mill. And then the new kinds of water mills of the 18th century. Use animals in a way that nowhere else did. Thousands, millions of them, every kind. And use coal extensively from the Middle Ages. Once you've done that, you've got 4 or 5 people working for you invisibly. And you can look at the Industrial Revolution as just taking that one step on. Whereas in Japan, you didn't have animals, you didn't have wind power, you didn't have water power, you didn't have coal power. And so it wasn't going anywhere. And it would have hit the same high-level equilibrium trap. In fact, it had, that China did, and France and Spain. So that's my explanation to